How should you answer a theory question? Well, it all depends on the actual question being asked, but basically the one thing you want to remember is the most common error with a theory question is just not providing sufficient detail. So if you go back and read old assessors' reports, and we'll talk about those in a later video, what they are and what you can get from them, but you can see a comment in 2008, there is little chance of being awarded full marks if only a few words are given. And also in 2012, very short responses or simply listing a few dot points usually does not result in high marks. So they're comments directly from the actual accounting examiner. So important to remember that. So let's take an example question. Identify one benchmark the business may use when assessing its profitability over a reporting period. So if you wrote the trend in the ratio or previous reporting periods, that's actually a correct answer. There's just not enough detail there. That's a dot point. That's not a sentence. So what you need to do is turn that into a complete sentence or paragraph. So the answer below in green is actually no really more insightful than the one above. It's just got greater depth. So for example, instead of just saying the trend, you could say the trend in the ratio is a useful probability benchmark. This is a comparison with the firm's past results. For example, what was the net profit margin last period? Did it go up or down? What about qualitative characteristics and accounting principles? Now, if you go to some of our videos at the beginning of the year in Chapter 1, we looked at a little strategy that said when I'm answering any of the qualitative characteristics or accounting principle questions, we want to use this little formula. Unless the question specifically says use the consistency principle, for example, you'll need to identify which qualitative characteristic or accounting principle you're talking about. You'll then need to define it, and then you'll need to relate it to that question. So we call this the IDR method. So identify the theory, which qualitative characteristic or accounting principle is appropriate. Define it, so explain or show the examiner that you know what it means, and then relate it to that particular question. So let's use an example. Let's say you were asked, the owner of a small business has decided to omit cents from figures listed in the balance sheet. Explain whether the owner is correct in doing this. Now, this question does not say use a qualitative characteristic or use an accounting principle, so you'd be free to choose. So the first thing we're going to do is identify a theory that helps us answer this question. So I'm going to choose relevance. I'm then going to define it to show the examiner that I know what that means. Relevance states that only information which influences decision making should be included in the firm's financial records. But I'm not going to get, if this is 2 marks, I'm not going to get 2 marks now because I haven't really said anything about the actual question. This is about when can you leave cents out of the balance sheet. So I'm going to go and relate this theory to this particular question. So what I'm going to say is I like to start the relate bit with the 3 words in this case, because that way you kind of naturally relate the next part to it. So in this case, the omission of cents is not material enough to affect any decision the owner makes based on the figures in the balance sheet. So that way you've listed all 3 parts, you've identified. So looking at how you'd write that, identify it, define it, and then relate it. And you can see the detail there. It's nice and detailed. You're using up all the space provided. We're not just answering it in sort of 8 to 10 words. What about if you get the elements of accounting? Well, what were they? They were assets, liabilities, owner's equities, revenues, and expenses. So if you get a question, again, follow the same formula, which is identify, define, and relate. So first of all, identify the element. What actual item is it? Is it an asset? Is it a revenue? And so on. Then define it. So give out the criteria of the particular element, and then relate it to that question. So let's have an example. On the 31st of December, a business paid $30,000 for rent for the next 3 years. With reference to the SAC 2 definition of the elements of accounting, explain how this transaction would be treated in the firm's records. So we would identify and say this is an asset. We would then define an asset. Now with elements questions, I like to do it a little bit differently. I like to do my defining and my relating at the same time. So I'm going to say an asset is a resource controlled by the entity, but I'm not going to end that sentence. I'm going to flow on and say, what do we control? We now legally control the property for the next 3 years. I'm then going to say there was a past event or transaction, so that's part of the definition. Now I'll relate it to this question by saying that was when we paid $30,000 for rent for the next 3 years. And then the last part of the definition of an asset is it must provide a future economic benefit, and I'll relate that by saying in this case we'll be able to occupy the building for the next 3 years. So in terms of writing that, I identified what it was an asset. I did the first part of the definition and related it at the same time, resource control. I then did the second part of the definition, which is a past event, and related it at the same time. And then I did the last part of the definition, which is it's got to have future economic benefits, and related it at the same time.